Hi. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for joining. This
Hi,
is
Wambui. How are you?
Sorry. Good. Howie.
this is the core group. We may have one or two more people slip on. So I think Aurelia, Leo, and Sioka also mentioned she might join just to listen, but she doesn't think she can co-write with us. But these are the core members of our working group. I think, Kim, you know Wambui, who is a mentor for our success workshop. And then Howie and Wangari are here. And so we can just get kicked off. Kim, I didn't ask, is it okay if I record this? Okay. So I thought I would just start off. So this call, for context, is our second call after we decided that we're gonna write together and that we decided we're going to focus on the dissertation chapter. And that will hopefully turn into the ESTS article on infrastructures next year. So it's a third kind of the special collections that we'll be working on. And so we're hoping to generate a lot of materials basically focused on our working group. And I think we talked about kind of an autoethnographic approach of basically reflecting on why we came together, our own unique experiences being part of the group. Wangari was just saying it feels overwhelming. I think that's okay. We can talk about that in the, you know what I mean? Like just reflecting on all of it all. And so we've kind of just gotten off to start, and we're still figuring out how we're going to do all this. But the plan is to use the research data share site essay as kind of our workspace, and then I think we'll probably co-write together in the Google Doc that I shared with everyone. Everyone else turned off their videos. Why? We can turn off our videos if you want for bandwidth, you guys, but it's totally fine to keep your video on. So what was I saying? Yes, so working together in RDS and then writing together probably in some sort of Google Doc. We haven't figured out the writing part yet. But right now I think what we're planning on doing is working through the data that we already have generated, and then annotating that together and then going from there and seeing what we want to say. But anyway, so the first thing I also shared were a couple of readings. And these readings Kim had actually shared with me, and I hadn't read them, so I started reading them this week, and they were pretty dense. And so I realized it might be nice to have Kim also join us on the call, because her work has really played off and made use of a lot of these concepts and others. And I thought it would be nice to have her help us frame the readings a little bit. I don't know how much you guys have been able to read all of them yet. They're quite different. Yeah, they use the concepts in different fields and with different kinds of domains and applications. So, and Kim also used it in her own work on disaster, and so yeah. So I was hoping that Kim could maybe start us off, and then feel free to drop off if you want. If you know, you don't have to stay for the whole call. And then the rest of the group, we can kind of dive more into also logistics towards the end of the call and figure out kind of what we want to do next, et cetera, et cetera.
So why don't one of you tell me a little more about the question you're trying to address in your writing about infrastructure? I mean, is it how can infrastructure support open data practices and open research in the Nairobi context? Is that the question?
So I think it's around there. And maybe this is also on me. So for, and Kim, you know this, but for the dissertation chapter, part of why I'm calling it Deutero and why I kind of threw those readings out there how we, Wangari and Mabui are probably like, oh, okay, what's this Deutero thing? Because we've always talked about this chapter as kind of just reflecting on us as a working group. But for me, the Deutero chapter, which is the last chapter in the dissertation, really is about thinking about data capacity in Nairobi and thinking about what kinds of skills, research, and otherwise we need and want to see moving forward. And what thinking about data and working on data allows us to do beyond just tech and data. So like what kinds of collaborative infrastructures, community building infrastructures, technology infrastructures, yes, but the skills that also need to come about hand in hand with that, and how we see that, I don't want to say filling a gap, but how that is different from what's currently going on, or how that, yeah, dovetails off of what we currently see in terms of the discourse and the work on data going on in Nairobi.
Okay. So I think it'll be helpful to know just a little bit about Gregory Bates and the figure that these concepts that Angela's put forward comes from, especially the concept of deutero. Bateson's famous for this concept of deutero-learning. And Bateson was a really quite crazy, in the best sense of the word, anthropologist. British, was married to the anthropologist Margaret Mead and did field work with her in Bali, but also did field work in New Guinea. And a notable thing, like in Bali, one of the things he and Mead did is use the camera for the first time in ethnography and took like a zillion pictures so that they could characterize particularly mom-child interactions, but very experimental, like didn't start knowing we're going to do this with the camera, but using the camera as a new tool to kind of think in new ways. An important thing about he has a famous book called Navin about a puberty ritual in New Guinea. But what's interesting, I think, for us about the book is it's organized where he tells the story of the ritual 3 times through 3 different analytic lenses. One, a psychological lens, one, a social, I'm forgetting the third. And so he was interested in how we see things and how we learn to see things in new ways. And that's really core to deutero-learning. How do you how does the system not just repeat itself, but actually learn to learn? That's what deutero-learning is. And I think it's interesting for this project because part of the promise of new data practices, new data infrastructure, is that not just we'll add more data and more information and more knowledge, but we will learn to produce new forms of knowledge and new practices that can really attend to changing conditions. So it's really a way of building capacity, not to address a stable ideal like modernization, but capacity to address a continually refreshed capacity to address changing conditions. So it's really exciting as an educational concept. It's very hard because you don't teach, it's not informational. I don't teach Angela, learn these 4 things and then you'll have deutero capacity. It's much more, you create the conditions in which people can learn to do something more than rote reproduction. Deutero-learning is put in comparison to proto-learning, which is repeat. You learn well, you learn to, and it's also, he connects the biological and the cognitive. So like bodily muscle memory is something that you cultivate for proto-learning. And importantly, you don't skip over proto-learning. So becoming very skilled at something is a precondition to the kind of expertise that's actually more flexible. And so it was a good challenge for me to think about how the concept can maybe be useful for your group. And Angela has shared a little bit of your exchange, but the possibility of open data enabling a kind of knowledge production practice that is both localized and yet not isolated out of a comparative and transnational perspective. So I think one one thing I want to talk y'all through a couple of questions, and then I think we can get to Deutero questions. But when you think about more open data infrastructure in the Nairobi research context, what do you worry about? Like, you worry that if you want to, you're going to worry that it's become the same old thing. Like, tell me a little bit about what would be a disappointing result 10 years from now with open data.
Well, as others are thinking, I can step in because open data has been almost 10 years. So the official open data, which is more statistical and government open data, was launched in 2011. So it is actually about 10 years. And they reached out to Leo, who's not on this call, but the other day to ask her to help them revise the policy, because I think they've been disappointed with how it's been executed, and pretty much because it's not used. So I think that's what's disappointing about open data in its current form and with its current data sets in Nairobi right now, is that it's not being used.
Why isn't it being used? Meaning, it's encouraged and just people aren't taking it up, or it's legally mandated, people are just ignoring it, or?
The data sets themselves are not being updated and refreshed, and so they're stale. Many of them are incomplete. I think there are questions about the quality of the data itself that's in the portal. And then there's so a lot of the portal was funded by the World Bank, for example, and other donors. And when the funding, I think it's been funded by like 3 cycles, and every time the cycle kind of dries up, then like support for it and the champions kind of also move on to the next thing. And so it doesn't have this kind of organic, sustained community drive behind it. It's often donor driven.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Wambui.
No, I was just going to say, I think part of the problem is that there's no buy-in at, who the people who matter. If it is a government department, for example, that should be uploading information on a website as part of open data principles. And by the way, we have, a bunch of new laws that are encouraging public participation and citizen access to information and all that good stuff. But it's all on paper, but it relies on will for it to happen. It relies on political will and different types of will, even just the interest to do it. So if you lack that, and then you lack an accountability system that will kind of push it, where I think even for us as citizens, we need to be much more engaged. I think that's where the problem is. So I think I agree with Angela that a concern would be that we have these wonderful laws and policies on paper that say, information should be available and accessible to all, but we still do not kind of come out to make sure that the information is current and is accessible, and that people know that it is there. So I think that would be a disappointment if further down the road we don't do much with open data. And maybe one more thing I'd say concerning data or information is that we to this flexible, approach where you say, yes, we can get budget information, for example. But beyond budget information, then let's connect budget information to what are we buying for our hospitals, what are we buying for our schools, and and beyond that, it kind of has a ripple effect. My fear is that there will be no ripple effect. We'll be stuck at let's get the budget information, and we don't see the bigger picture. Yeah.
Those are really good articulations, and I have a few comments. Do you want to add anything to the list of what you're worried about? Okay, let me put a question back to you. Do you think that it sounds as though one reason there's not investment in providing the data is the promise of the data is not people aren't enrolled in. And do you think that in your mind is the connection to public participation? So it's not just people making the data available, but people wanting it there so that they can use it. And do you see the goal of, is one way to put the goal of open data collaborative knowledge production, where citizens can have the same data that government officials have, so that there can be critical analysis of decisions about what to buy in schools? And I mean, is collaborative knowledge production how you see, and thus accountability? Is that a good way to put how you see the promise of open data?
Maybe I could comment. I was excited when you say the word people, because I'm a psychologist, and I was thinking of, do people actually want collective data? I must say it happens, but more informally. And my experience just getting data from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or CBOs, community-based organizations, is it's like we're doing all these things, but we don't really think we should be writing it or recording all these things or transcribing or archiving. So that's an issue about the value and the priority, as Wamboi said, of this data. So what? So if we get all this data and archive it, so what? I mean, it's happening informally. We are always doing collective knowledge production. That's for sure. That's straight from our traditional systems to date. You know, that's going on. But the more formal systems, why I was really attracted to this space was also the qualitative inquiry bit, which, you know, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I think qualitative methods have really been downplayed by especially high-level academia, you know. But I was happy for a space where I could actually generate qualitative data amongst peers and create it live in a system, you know, co-created. I would say that the mentality around we actually need as a priority to have data driven. We are not a knowledge economy yet, in my view, in my opinion. We are, you know, just mostly waiting for whoever donor will come with anything without really defining formally, more formally, our needs. I think we do have people doing collective knowledge production, but just not formal and just not archived and just not, you know, packaged. So it will be more like random than more systemized. That's my take. And especially the mindset around research has also been heavily driven with quantitative, you know, methods, and not really valuing that there's this other whole world and we could actually contribute to it. Thank you.
So this is really useful too. So the point that there's already a lot of collaborative knowledge production, but it sounds like it's the kind of collaborative knowledge production within a very, like within these donor-driven projects, where you're kind of, you know, in advance what you're producing. It's not really exploratory. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right on the money. That's right on point. Yeah. So
Okay.
not really, not really from the grassroots up. It's just whichever begging bowl we can bring and whatever we can catch. Not really also creating our agenda and saying this is really where we would like more funding in. Right. For instance, my work that is very highly specialized is with the deaf community, and it's very typical that I will not get data when I need. And so it has been a big frustration, even at an individual level. So I'm glad for this space to collaborate and create, you know, a system. And I'm also interested on learning about the systems, you know, that system of knowledge production and how that would run. So in this research is on many levels, very useful to me. It's not just the actual work we are doing, but how we are doing it is part of the research. As you know, in qualitative methodology, the researcher's role is very crucial. So it's very exciting for me. Yeah.
No, one thing I hear. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I think, thank you very much, and I'm grateful with this discussion. One is the definition of what you're talking about is not very clear. Why I'm saying this, because we are dealing with different scope of people in Nairobi. We're not only dealing with one scope of people, we're dealing with illiterate and literate. We're dealing with rich and poor. We are dealing with modern and we're dealing with traditionalists. We're dealing with pagans, we're dealing with Christians and Muslims and different people who have different faiths. So the data we want to speak out, the funnel on the layers of what you're talking about, it's not very clear in terms of who consume what data. Why I'm saying this, if you go to universities, you find that there are a lot of data which are generated every day through a lot of research and through a lot of things that are happening, and nobody's out there because you want to pass exams. You go to different schools and even in different places. You have been capturing images and when you look at cultural issues, which are very defining, like some of the songs that have been sung recently by young people within the cities of Nairobi. You can't even understand what they're singing, but that's a new language called Sheng, where they're twisting a lot of words and taking it backwards. And so, that's what you're trying to, like, this kind of new meaning. What is it? So that this data is very, and it's quite a lot, and so that's one thing that also we need. The other thing also we need to look at who wants this data. It looks like everybody wants this data, but they're not aware. That's the other problem. That what do they buy from the data we are talking about? So for me, those are very critical issues, like who buys what. Everybody outside there wants data, but they don't tell you. Even the person selling maize might need data, which is so those are the kind of things I'm just trying to, because I'm a sociologist, and that's why I look at things from a sociologist perspective, given that with the bias of governance and security, which is my field that I work around. So when I'm sitting here, I look at those kind of, like, how do you make the city better in the next coming 20 years? And these people, interaction in this clash, the clash of civilization. Thank you.
So this is an example, I think, of the kind of problem characterization that you're seeing as needed through new data infrastructure. And if I hear you right, your emphasis is on the need to characterize, understand, and deal with a lot of difference across generation, different across class, religion, et cetera. And so you need to, and do you think that is that phenomena, the just heterogeneity of Nairobi, is that poorly understood, or just it's the next step that's the problem? Like, how do you deal with it so that it's a productive rather than disabling set of differences?
It's something which is not understood, and that's why you find that one, we are struggling with civil servants who do not know the meaning of data, which one of my colleagues I just talked about. Even updating the website and making sure that the website has information that can target young people who are at their 20s and who are looking for work. What kind of language can you listen? Someone was dropped out of school, someone was been sexually molested and wants some information on how to deal with certain situations. They can't get this information because maybe they have not gone to school, and the kind of language maybe they use to understand each other is also different, which is I'm trying to talk about, because this is the generation we're talking about. This is the bigger layer. This is the bigger layer that, and that's the layer that needs a lot of information to be pushed down on them. And then there's also another issue that in terms of who do you sell the information to? Because one of the things is that you see every day people collecting a lot of information. Move to every hub. I've been to every hub in Nairobi, and I've seen a lot of people coming up with software applications, coming up with and at the end of the day, they fail because they don't test it, they don't involve the public, they fear. So there's a disconnection between all these kind of players.
Yeah, yeah. So I think one thing you're getting to, which I heard also in the point that, you know, the concern that people would get stuck on one kind of data and not, what I hear you saying is there needs to be data creativity. Like, how do you, really think about what kind of data you need to characterize a problem like this if the data isn't available because, you know, you're trying to understand kids that aren't in school and thus you can't capture them with school data. You need people to be creative about what substitute data or proxy data that you could use in order to understand things that you don't have data for. And this is a big problem in my area of research. I mostly work on environmental issues. And on one hand, there's a lot of data. On the other hand, there's a real scarcity of data. So I think the best practitioners are very creative about, you know, can you use this, if you're missing data, can you use this data instead, knowing its limits? So you have to be able to be very reflective about the limits of data, because a lot of the data in the environmental world, I expect, like the social data in Nairobi, it's very noisy. You know, it's incomplete. You don't know where it was collected or who it was collected. And I think this does relate to the deutero capacity, where you want to not only build the data, but you want to build the capacity to use that data in creative ways. But it's not a linear process, because unless you enroll people in the promise of what you could do with data, they're not going to share the data. They're not going to do the extra work of making it available. And I also just heard in these comments something Angela has described for me before is, you know, it's not for lack of research in Nairobi. There's a lot of data collection going on, but it tends to be very asking the same questions over and over again. So it's, you know, there's a great example from Bateson of, you know, he actually tested some of his research on animals and dolphins. And so how do you get, and there's this, in one of the articles you read, there's this really memorable story of, you know, you can train a dolphin to, you know, do its tricks. But what happens when the dolphin learns that what it gets rewarded for is doing a new kind of trick? And so the dolphin learns what the context is and thus can do something new. And so I think that really what it would look like to build a creative data commons in Nairobi is you have to get people being not thinking in these very narrow terms about what good data is. I think the project-based donor model is a big part of the problem that we've heard a lot about in Latin America too, because you're told in advance what you're supposed to get out of the data collection. There's no time to, you know, kind of push things to the next kind of step. Tell me more about, like, when you're training a new generation of researchers, I mean, your students and the people that will come after you, what are the things that will keep them from becoming creative data practitioners? And you mentioned exams, the way they're trained to, like, go from, you know, they're trained to use their research to meet these, either pass an exam or satisfy the donor. But what are the things that are kind of pressing down on people so that they can't actually be creative in their data practices? So funding, an exam-based system in education. What are the other things?
I would say there are two major challenges, if I would cluster them. systemic challenges and individual challenges. I'm trying to remember the person who said this quote that in the 21st century, the biggest task of any learner will be to learn and to relearn. So it's a very famous quote now that we're using in the 21st century. So I would say on an individual level, those people with that character strength of being flexible or resilient or expedient or prompt or savvy, especially with technology, they will fare better in this century because it's not so much what you know, but how you learn. I think when you started off, you talked about learning how to learn. And I think that that's going to be at an individual level. I'm already beginning to see, as a psychologist, I'm interested in, individual differences. I'm already beginning to see people who are struggling with this transition into online learning, and people who are acing it, who are having a good time. There are all kinds of individual differences and they're complex. On the systemic level, it's basically what we've said. And in addition, I would say as well, status quo. A lot of the professors just holding on to only quantitative and only a certain way of learning, and especially in the research space where I am most active, there's a hierarchy in knowledge production. Who owns knowledge? And yeah, we know that knowledge is not so democratic, and there's societies who own, things. But I think that knowledge should really be for every human being who has a capacity to think, But we all know that that's not the case, and knowledge is very, very warmly embraced by those people who think they should know and other people who should not know. And so there's all these hierarchies, and it's a big barrier to creativity. Another systemic challenge is funding. I'm always in meetings where, people are praised for having gotten all this funding. And I say, what about when I did a grassroots campaign and fundraise on my own and got this amount, to do things, being facilitated, being incentivized, I think has become the buzzword for research. And, we call it vitamin M when people want money just to talk, even just to say hello, you've got to drop a coin first. So it's become like a real commercialization of knowledge, which actually impedes free thinking. Thank you.
That's really insightful. And I think we spoke at the beginning about if you want to tell someone, don't treat knowledge hierarchically. Even if they agree with you, which is not very often, they don't know how to not do that. Like, it's not so easy as just being obedient, like the dolphin being obedient. You have to change something kind of behind cognition that puts them in a different place. And I think this is the promise of infrastructure, where designing the infrastructure so that you're not telling people to change, but they're working in a different way, and they come out of the infrastructure with a sense of the possibilities of qualitative data, or a sense of the possibilities of having 5 people producing knowledge together where they don't know at the beginning what the hypothesis is, where it really is exploratory. And
I think you're right. The context, changing that context is difficult.
Yeah.
And one more thing, it just came to my mind as you spoke. A lot of published works are biased from the start, not only in terms of knowing the hypothesis, but that the result should be positive. So in positivists, models, they kind of want to say, we are not confirming a null hypothesis. This has got to really produce significance. So even if I would like to do qualitative data production and I want to do all this, findings, publishing my findings, but who will be my audience? I mean, I live in an infrastructure, in an ecosystem that does not celebrate that, It's a real struggle. And again, people are looking down on when qualitative research is published, and and always not being defined on its own terms. It's defined on the terms of quantitative, which doesn't even make sense. Those two are beautiful on their own, and they should just stand alone, not necessarily one defined in terms of the other. Yeah.
Is a pathway to changing this at a broader level to, and it was mentioned civil servants as important actors was mentioned earlier, like you want them, a civil servant responsible for education in schools, for example, to be more open to what they can learn from qualitative data, for example. Is that one way to think about one of the goals of this kind of effort?
Okay, I think that's a good question. I'm learning a lot in this process, and the process of learning a lot, it's taking me into deep thinking, because I'm asking myself, who are the custodians of information? Where does the information come from? Then once I give out the information, because the citizens are the custodians of information. The citizens are the ones who share information each and every day. In everything that you do, everything we live, that's where the information, whether I go to shop, whether I go to birthday party, whether I go sporting events, because we congregate as in a sporting events as people call fans, cheering a particular sporting event, and that becomes a process. When I go to shop around, I go to a place called a market, which becomes a very, and this is where information is collected. Because one is that because of the sovereignty of the nation, we have given people a mandate to run what our governments through the constitution. And it makes the civil servants very powerful, because through that power we have given, and that information is kept in laws called the Official Secrets Act, which becomes a very big challenge for and restricts free access to information.
Mm-hmm.
So that becomes very, very important, because when we are dealing with data, that will always also become a reference point for us when you're talking about access to information and issues of Official Secrets Act. Because that is what, and we are seeing happening even in the internet, where we have a lot of internet shutdowns, where because people cannot be able to share information back and forth. So that will also affect, because it has happened in Nairobi, where I find that some parts of Nairobi have not been able to have access to information, because one is that they're within the informal settlements. So when you're within the informal settlements, it means the neighborhood where you're living cannot be able to get speed internet, which means you're not able to get. So one of the other things is that when you see civil servants are not able to give information within their website, if you go to their offices, you find they're working in rusty desks. It's because it's a design process, which means it's taking people back in terms of development through a corrupt system. So that becomes very easy. And then when you're dealing with the issue of data infrastructure, because now it has become very good, because people are able to access information through Zoom. I can be able to communicate to the lowest civil servants at the lowest level through Zoom. But they choose what information to give you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the challenge is. And how do you deal with this kind of, because that's where the paradigms that we need to climb over and deal with this kind of, because it's a funnel, and when you're climbing on different layers, what are the layers? Because the person who controls wealth in this country, in this city, is the person who accesses information on every minute, every second. And that's what creation. And that's why we're having a lot of challenges within the city.
And part of your critique is that So one, the hierarchical access to information, but also the person that has access, the civil servant, for example, they are using, they're not being creative in their use of information, using it in a very instrumental way. Is that the part of the critique?
Yes, yes, because you see what is happening. If you look at the elections of the city, you find that the elections of the city, the governor who was elected within Nairobi has been associated being a member of a gang. And you see, gangism has become part of now the influence around data. Because the data we're getting right now is not data which is based on people's values, and data which are driven based on certain business enterprise and certain elites who are controlling certain information. You find even as my colleagues were talking about, like the other week, uh, the county government of Nairobi was saying that they're no longer going to be paying for security for the schools. So the schools are going to pay for the school security by themselves. What does it mean? It means now the school is going to take back the cost to the parents, and it's going to affect the issue of quality of information and quality of education. Because now the parents will be working so hard to make sure that the children in school, paying more for COVID, paying more for security, paying more for other things like that. So it becomes very challenging because these parents will not have time to access information, and it also not have time to educate that because they'll be spending time on looking for how to take the children to school.
So is one of your points here that if parents had had different data, they would have protested the shift of the security expense to the schools, and so they would have been more active respondents to that change?
Yes, because one is that these are growing cities, and growing like Nairobi is a growing city and is growing every day. So we need like data which can be like on parents can get information very fast and see how to deal with this kind of challenge. Because one of the biggest things that also we look at time, or time is affecting resources. Because one is that if you're in an office where you're taking almost around 4 hours or 5 hours to get certain information, then you spend a lot of either you using that time in business or at your office space or doing other things. So you find that that time is lost, and if you combine those many hours, you find that you're losing billions and billions of shillings because of lack of investment in data infrastructure.
So one way I hear this, I mean, I think we can take it back to deutero-learning, is that the current uses of data and the possible uses of more data is that it wouldn't change what people are seeing with the data because it's so rigidly framed that you get more data, you don't understand the problem in a new way, but the many problems. And so the challenge of building infrastructure that breaks the frame, so to speak, of how people are understanding the city, distribution of wealth, et cetera. And and the idea that you need students not just staying within the frame, but being creative about when the frame needs to change.
Okay,
So in other,
okay, sorry. Another issue that I also want to say is about the giving up about education, because young people are also seeing that there's no need of going to school. Because some of them are seeing that they can make wealth very fast through gangism, through prostitution, through cartels. So that is also a notion that is coming up. So like some people are seeing some of their colleagues finish the school at maybe, and have gone to university, but they don't get jobs. But there's someone who dropped out of school, maybe at the lower primary level. This person has worked out and now is driving big cars, controlling a lot of wealth. And so that's also a notion that is there. And so the issue is about how, if this lack of information about how people can have their own life skills to survive, as survival skills, especially for those people who are trying to live around their own ways, especially women. Like women, how they survive around because of the issue, a lot of domestic violence and a lot of issues, because women are so much disadvantaged within the city, and they cannot be able, like, they are, because they're looking after, some of them are looking after children, some of them are trying abandoned homes, a lot of single mothers, a lot of, so I'm just trying to open up the debate and look
Yeah.
so that we can
So I think one thing I would suggest is, as you all continue your discussion, to keep running this list of problems that new data practices need to address. And social problems like the one here, where the way I hear it is, where in the near term need for survival, people are opting for, are seeing, quick wealth generation as the best answer to their problems in a way that actually has a very short-lived success. And so you want them to be able to see the bigger consequences are longer to the problem of, civil servants making decisions about how to fund education in a way that, doesn't recognize, or it's not, at least not up for public debate, that it actually would undermine participation in the educational system because of how it shifts the burden. So if you have a list of just tough problems that data needs to help you understand and respond to, and then a separate kind of list of what's a bad way to deal with those problems. Like, what's a bad use of data that would just reproduce the same old way of describing them that doesn't go anywhere. And like in my own research, for example, in describing the health effects of pollution, there is a strong emphasis on disparities. Poor people get more pollution than rich people. And that's true. But we know that, like, we've known that for 30 years. It hasn't moved anything in the way that we've dealt with the problem. So we need to not just characterize problems, but have a characterization that allows you to kind of shift it. And so the kind of things that would be poor outcomes of data practices. And then the third of what kind, because you don't know what, part of the challenge is you don't know what good data practices should do. You want to leverage the promise of good data. And so the sense of how do you change the conditions of knowledge production where people would be more open to the use of qualitative data, or more open to a kind of community-based research that really listens to young people, for example, and doesn't just, put them in that same old box. And just an idea to think about is, we have some other researchers in our community that work with the digital platform you're using that are thinking about what kind of community data infrastructure would be useful in their communities. And so one thing you might do as a kind of thought exercise is imagine projects that might move the way people think about and use data. And I think I can tend to the event that Angela, you ran at the library. Like, if you brought young people into the research data share infrastructure, how could you design a little project? What I've found is if you bring people into data infrastructure, they learn to love data in new ways, because it can be really, if it's loosely enough structured where it can really exploratory, it gets to be kind of addictive, because they want to, they want more data and more data, they begin to see and see what you can see with it, but you have to be inside of it to know. And an example I'll give you is years ago now, environmental data like pollution data became available on the internet. And at first people were very critical. They said, information is not power. Just because you know the pollution in your community does not mean that you can fix it, that you have any power over the companies and the government. But what happened is people started exploring that data, and it made them angry. And so the way that data availability grew up a generation of environmental activists that are just incredibly strong. So a very unanticipated, it was a use of that data, because the purpose was not really, it told them how to fix the problem. It produced these environmental activists that previously were not mobilized citizens. One of them that's very, I still work with many years later, is she was a shrimper, mom with 5 kids, not an activist. And she started exploring data, and man, she is a force to deal with now, incredibly expert on the companies that are polluting her community. And so imagining what kind of data infrastructure and data availability would actually produce that kind of change in Nairobi, where you have parents mobilized as education activists, or people mobilized for transportation infrastructure, where you actually have a citizenry that's asking something, has ideas to ask for of the civil servants, but you also want the civil servants mobilized in a different way.
I see that we're actually running out of time, but this has been so good. I just want to add maybe one thing, is that I think what you've described, Kim, it was kind of the orienting or like ideal that started a lot of the open data movement kind of push, was like, yes, an active citizenry that will hold the government to account, using information that they now have access to that used to be behind closed walls, but now people can access. So then they get energized, and then they want to hold people accountable. But then that never really played out. And then it became a tired kind of narrative that was then used to get donor money. And then, the governance, like open data for better governance became, and for transparency and accountability, like those are all key buzzwords, that ended up being just used on both ends, from those who apply for funding and then the funders who give them up, like in their calls for proposals. They just came kind of another part of the next thing that then got funded. And so, yeah,
I think that's a double bind right there, is that it's not that you don't need more transparency and a mobilized citizenry, but even that has been locked into a certain frame. And so, it's become a kind of cynical endeavor. And I think that's precisely, the kind of inertia you get when something that is in fact promising becomes kind of locked down. That's a real double bind. And so, and it's those kinds of contradictions that you need to creatively imagine what kind of data infrastructure can work within that paradoxical space.
That doesn't then also get locked down or captured in this like highly donor funded and corporatized space.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the potential for commercialization and kind of marketization of anything that comes out of the system.
That's my
commercial data production
is that this could equally also be turned into get captured in that same way, and that people will then look to qualitative data just as the next frontier for the same kind of commercialized model not for its
Yeah.
radical potential.
Yeah, I like that you've captured the word paradox because it's a contradiction. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I need to leave just this minute. And it was a privilege and an honor to be with you all, hang out for 1 hour and really learn a lot. It's been an interesting journey being in this team, so I appreciate it.
Thanks, my
No,
buddy. We'll chat more.
Thank you. Bye.
I know that you probably need to do just a little organizing, so I'll drop off, but this has been really productive for me, and I hope we can stay in conversation. It's helped my thinking about how we're thinking about this. So thank you a lot.
Kim,
Thank you.
as you're going, Kim, just keep on, let's keep on discussing.
Okay,
Don't
yeah.
stay away, don't stay away. Okay?
Okay, I'm happy. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
One boy, did you want to say something? You've been typing so much in the chat, but
Yeah, I thought it would be easier to just type some of my thoughts and reactions. So nothing to add right now, but I found the link between some of the concepts, the double bind, deutero-learning and post-normal science. Now, the direct connection to what we are doing, because the readings were, applied to different contexts. And to really see this the beyond normal science. I think that's what we are trained to do, even in as scholars, or like if you're doing a master's program, or if you're doing any research or any type, just stay within the lines, count the people and just figure out what that counting means. And what's interesting for me, even in what we are doing, is when we are saying let's go beyond counting the lines, you're essentially coming up against power structures. And what's actually very, very interesting for me is that it's linking, and I tried to say this in one of my earlier comments, it's a dismantling of structures across the board. In Kenya right now, we are talking about how colonial structures remain in our system, and they've created a lot of inequality, marginalization, oppression, exploitation, all that stuff. And I connect this to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, where it's essentially about that: marginalization, oppression, exploitation, etc. So when we talk about, and I think I'm just having a very dim light bulb moment at this point, but when we connect this even to our research situation, where we are saying we don't have to do normal science, for us, we are literally coming up against yet another power structure. And it's uncomfortable. And when you come up against a structure, you are causing trouble, so to speak.
Yeah.
And trouble means resistance. And resistance comes in different forms. So, but I think this is good. Yesterday I was in a panel discussion about press freedom. And as we were talking, I just almost got goosebumps thinking that these so-called freedoms that we keep talking about are linked. Academic freedom, the freedom to ask questions, to talk to anybody, and the person with data is not just a civil servant or the government minister or the World Bank. It is me. And I have access to the resources to also ask you questions and to get answers, and that those answers are not thrown in a bookshelf somewhere to gather dust, but I can use them for my good, for my community's good, and so on. So I think, interestingly, this whole discussion is exposing deeper, kind of political problems. And these political problems are manifested, in academia, in media, in, all these sectors where we now have people fighting for Black Lives Matter, or, let's break down these colonial systems, let's bring down these statues of these racist people who colonized us. It's I don't even know. I don't even know what I'm thinking right now, but I'm feeling like it's a bigger thing, and it's a good thing because it is saying ultimately it is about people. It's about individuals. It's about dignity and human dignity, which has been denied. I have a right to ask. Sorry, there's some noise in the background here. I have a right to ask questions, but I have a right to also be asked questions and contribute to making where I am better, because I'm giving you information. We are collaborating. We are not, it's not silos, because that's the other problem we have.
Mhm.
We operate in silos. I gather data and I keep it to myself, and I'll use it for what I want. So the World Bank will gather its own data, and yeah, they'll have a repository, etc., but it's World Bank data. I was talking with one of my relatives is in the nutrition field, and she was listening to a panel discussion about, nutrition, in Kenya, etc. So it was, I think, co-funded, this panel, or co-hosted by UNICEF. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which does similar work around nutrition, will not be at such a panel because there's politics around it, who will host and so on. Now, what kind of nonsense is that? And we are really just talking about, how can we help people be food secure, eat better, all that good stuff. So I I'm just fascinated, and I think I'm going on and on, but I'm just excited. But I'm just fascinated by when you go down to the root, whatever sector you are in, research, media, whatever, name it, even community work, we are ultimately talking about the same thing. Let's just break down this top-down, power-focused setups that ignore the ordinary person who is who should be the center of it all. Yeah, Angela, you asked for it. You told me to speak.
Maybe, Wamboi, I think I love the way you're putting it out, and that is quite passionate. Something I just need to share is about innovation. I sat down with some of my friends and we were talking about innovation in Kenya. And I told my friends, if we go about innovation the way we are going, we're not going to achieve certain things. There are people who walk around with a bucket and sell buns or called mandazis. And they started this innovation almost around 2 years ago, where they would come every day in the morning where people are passing, and they would sell 2 buckets. And in each bucket, we had almost over 100 of them at 5 shillings, which means 5 shillings times 100, that comes to around 500 shillings. So in a day, they were making, like in a corner, they're making close to 1,000. So this man or this person, or there's a group of people in informal settlements, have almost around 100 points that are selling. So this is information. When someone is looking at information and looking at information on innovation, someone looks at, it has to be a Silicon Valley or something like that. But these are things which people are doing outside there. There are people even who are selling chapatis for a living. And these chapatis they're selling for a living, they're selling close to almost around 200 of them per day. Better than someone who's going to an office and selling chapati. Those are like pancakes.
Yeah.
And they're selling, they're close to almost, someone who's selling almost close to 5,000 of those kind of chapatis in a day. So this is information that is sold outside there, and which is data which is within the people, and they're making a lot of resources that is not put on public domain. One is because people go for conventional information, or we call it conventional wisdom.
You know, this kind of example and associated data is going to become increasingly important in the US context, because in the COVID situation where established jobs have just disappeared. And so I think more people are going to be producing income through the informal sector. And so the question of how do you cultivate innovation in the informal sector, using examples like with this to think with and to think about what innovation is going to have a global significance in a way that it didn't a few years ago, because of the kind of informalization of the economy, even in places like the US. So it's interesting to think of Nairobi as a rich site for learning about that will have a lot of relevance, beyond Nairobi.
As I wind up, the other thing also I want to, it's about publishing. And this is the struggle that we've had every now and then about publishing. How do we publish? And how do you go about everything? Because do we go for the conventional way? This is something that we need to know how to go about it, because how are we going to publish data? How are we going to publish information? How are we going to make sure that everything is happening? Because this is where we get it wrong, because people want us to publish in journals, people want us to publish in certain things which are authorities. So how do you deal with that issue of publishing information?
Yeah. One thing I just want to say that has come to me in this conversation is that I think part of what you're dealing with here is how do you deal with post-coloniality in knowledge practices and infrastructure? Because there's been a lot of work on how post-coloniality is everywhere, but we're talking about how it is in where its legacies are in knowledge production. And it's, in terms of Bateson, I think post-coloniality is rather like proto-learning. It's the repetitive rote learning, like it keeps reproducing itself. But if you really want to understand like emergent forms of innovation, not only what data do you need, but as you pointed out, how do you design the infrastructure so that it's really generative in that way? No, I think your group can do a lot of really, really important thinking on this. So it's just great that you all have come together.
Well, thank you. I know we've lost some folks as everyone drops off, but thank you so much, Kim. It's been really helpful to have you here to kind of keep asking more questions for us to also think about.
I always have questions.
And they're always so good.
Are you going to transcribe this?
Yeah, I'll save this and then I can transcribe it and share it. We have our archive of our calls. So.
Yeah. No, I think that, these are really, you're really making new articulations here. So it's important. It's really great to both do it and return to it and analyze these conversations themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll come back and talk to you again at some point, I hope.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Howie. Thanks.